The fog over Brooklyn. In late August 1776, George Washington's fledgling Continental Army faced what seemed like certain annihilation, because after a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Long Island, 9,000 American troops were trapped in Brooklyn Heights with the British Army preparing to storm their positions and the Royal Navy controlling the East River behind them. Surrender or destruction seemed inevitable for this ragtag force that had dared to challenge the might of the British Empire. On the night of August 29, Washington ordered a desperate evacuation, and throughout the night boats of every description ferried soldiers silently across the river to Manhattan, while a southerly wind kept British warships from sailing up the river to intercept them. As dawn approached and daylight threatened to expose the entire operation to British eyes, a thick fog descended over the river, shrouding the evacuation completely so that the British could hear the creaking of oars and the low commands of officers, but could see absolutely nothing through the milky whiteness. When the last American boat pushed off from the Brooklyn shore around 7 in the morning, the fog lifted as if on cue, and Washington had saved his entire army, every single man and most of their equipment, which meant the American Revolution would live to fight another day. The clouds over Kokura. On August 9, 1945, the B-29 bomber named Boxcar flew toward its primary target, the Japanese city of Kokura, which housed one of Japan's largest munitions factories and had been chosen specifically for its military significance. Aboard was the Fat Man plutonium bomb, a weapon capable of destroying an entire city and ending thousands of lives in an instant. And the crew had trained for this moment with the precision that such a mission demanded. But when the bomber arrived over Kokura, the city was hidden beneath thick clouds and heavy smoke that had drifted from a neighboring city firebombed the day before, and 3 separate bombing runs failed to find a visual target, which was an absolute requirement for the mission. With anti-aircraft fire intensifying and fuel running dangerously low, the pilot made a fateful decision that would determine which city would be erased from history. He diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki. And there, too, clouds obscured the city until the very last possible moment, when a brief break in the overcast appeared just long enough for the bombardier to release the bomb visually, and Nagasaki was destroyed not by strategy or intention, but by a patch of clouds over Kokura that simply refused to clear. The winter outside Moscow. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the plan was devastatingly simple on paper: destroy the Soviet Union in a swift summer campaign before winter could arrive and bog everything down. The German war machine, designed specifically for lightning-fast movements and coordinated strikes, initially swept all before it, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners and vast territories in what seemed like an unstoppable advance toward Moscow. But then came the autumn Rasputitsa, the season of mud, which transformed Russian roads into endless seas of mire that swallowed trucks and tanks and stalled the advance at the worst possible moment. And when the temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero in December, the invasion ground to a halt just miles from the Kremlin, with German tank engines refusing to start and lubricants turning to grease and weapons freezing solid in soldiers' hands. The men, equipped only for a summer campaign, froze to death in their positions, while Soviet troops in white camouflage and felt boots launched a counterattack that pushed the Germans back from Moscow's outskirts, condemning Germany to a two-front war it could not possibly win and proving that the winter of 1941 did what the Red Army alone could not yet do. The fog at Dunkirk. In late May 1940, over 300,000 British and Allied troops found themselves trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, their backs to the English Channel and the German army closing in from 3 sides with every reason to expect total victory. Their annihilation seemed so certain that British planners hoped to rescue perhaps 30 or 40,000 men at most, but then the weather intervened in ways that no one could have predicted or planned for. The English Channel, normally choppy and treacherous even on calm days, fell flat and still, a glassy calm that allowed hundreds of small civilian craft, the famous little ships, to put her back and forth from the shallow beaches to waiting destroyers without swamping or foundering. And a dense mist settled over Dunkirk itself, hiding the vulnerable lines of exhausted soldiers from German artillery spotters and dive bombers, while heavy clouds over Germany prevented the Luftwaffe from launching the sustained air attacks that Goering had promised would finish the trapped army. For 9 days the weather held just long enough to evacuate 338,000 men. And though Churchill rightly noted that wars are not won by evacuations, Britain kept its army and stayed in the war because of it. The rains before Vienna. In the spring of 1529, Suleiman the Magnificent led perhaps 120,000 Ottoman soldiers from Constantinople toward Vienna, the gateway to Central Europe, with the intention of bringing all of Christendom under Ottoman rule once and for all. The campaign was meticulously planned and seemed unstoppable, but the weather had other plans entirely and would prove more powerful than any army. Unusually heavy rains fell throughout the long march through the Balkans and Hungary, turning primitive roads into rivers of mud that swallowed horses and wagons and exhausted the men who had to pull the heavy equipment through the mire. The massive siege artillery, the very tools needed to breach Vienna's formidable walls, became hopelessly bogged down, and Suleiman was forced to abandon most of his cannons along the route, arriving before Vienna with only light guns utterly inadequate for a serious siege. The rains continued throughout the siege as well, swelling the moats, flooding the tunnels dug by sappers, and spoiling gunpowder while disease swept through the sodden camps and demoralized the elite janissaries who began refusing orders to attack. After less than 3 weeks, with winter approaching and his army melting away from sickness and desertion, Suleiman lifted the siege and retreated through the same horrific mud, and Vienna would not fall for another 150 years. The Typhoons Off Japan. Twice in the 13th century, Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor who had conquered China and most of Asia, attempted to invade Japan, and twice he was defeated not by Japanese swords or samurai skill, but by typhoons that rose from the sea to destroy his fleets. In 1274, a fleet of some 900 vessels carrying 40,000 troops landed at Hakata Bay and initially overwhelmed the samurai defenders with superior tactics and gunpowder weapons. But when night fell and the Mongols returned to their ships, a powerful typhoon struck, smashing perhaps 200 vessels against the rocky coast and drowning 13,000 men. Undaunted by this disaster, Kublai assembled an even larger force for a second invasion in 1281, gathering over 4,000 ships carrying perhaps 140,000 soldiers in what remains the largest amphibious invasion in human history until D-Day in 1944. For 2 months, the Mongols and Japanese fought to a bloody stalemate along the fortified coastline, neither side able to deliver a decisive blow. And then on August 15, a massive typhoon struck for 2 full days, obliterating the tightly packed Mongol fleets as ships were smashed against each other and hurled onto the rocks. Contemporary accounts speak of tens of thousands drowning, their bodies clogging the bays, and perhaps 70% of the invasion force perished in what the Japanese called kamikaze, the divine wind, believing their islands were protected by the gods, a name that would echo into the 20th century when it was given to the suicide pilots who themselves became a last desperate defense against another invasion. The mud in Teutoburg Forest. The Roman Empire at its height seemed unstoppable, with legions that had conquered Gaul and Greece and Egypt and Spain, but in the dense forests of Germania in the year 9 AD, 3 entire legions simply vanished from history. Publius Quinctilius Varus led the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions, some 15,000 elite soldiers accompanied by auxiliaries and camp followers, back toward the Rhine in September, trusting his Germanic guide Arminius, who had been educated in Rome and served as a Roman cavalry commander and seemed the perfect ally. But Arminius was leading them into a trap, and as the Roman column entered the Teutoburg Forest, torrential rains turned the narrow tracks into impassable bogs that stretched the column out for miles and made it impossible to maintain formation. The heavy wagons carrying supplies and artillery stuck fast and had to be abandoned, and for days the Romans struggled through mud and rain, exhausted and drenched and unable to see more than a few feet into the dense forest that pressed in on all sides. Then Arminius's warriors struck from the cover of the trees, launching javelins and disappearing back into the forest, slaughtering the trapped legionaries piece by piece over the course of several days until Varus fell on his sword and the legion ceased to exist. The defeat was so total that the Roman numbers 17, 18, and 19 were never used again, and Emperor Augustus wandered his palace at night crying out, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." While the Rhine became Rome's permanent northern border and the Germanic tribes remained free, their descendants one day helping to bring down the Western Roman Empire itself. The mud at Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, between Napoleon's France and the British-led coalition under the Duke of Wellington, was decided before the first cannon shot was fired, because torrential rains on June 17 and the morning of the 18th had turned the battlefield into a quagmire. Napoleon, a master of artillery, knew his cannonballs would bury themselves uselessly in the mud rather than bouncing to cut through enemy lines. So he delayed the attack until nearly noon, waiting for the ground to dry just enough to make his guns effective. Those lost hours proved absolutely fatal to his plans, because by the time the French finally engaged Wellington's forces in any meaningful way, the Prussian army under Marshal Blucher was already marching toward the battlefield and could be heard in the distance. When the Prussians arrived in force during the late afternoon, the French were fully committed to breaking Wellington's line and could not reposition to meet this new threat approaching their flank. Napoleon's imperial ambitions, his final gamble to reclaim his empire, ended in the mud of a Belgian field, and Europe would be reshaped by powers meeting in Vienna rather than by French dominance.